On June 23, 2023, a column of armored vehicles bearing the insignia of the Wagner Group crossed the Russian border from Ukraine and began advancing toward Moscow. Within hours, the column had seized control of military facilities in Rostov-on-Don, neutralized Russian air defense units that attempted to intercept it, and covered several hundred kilometers of Russian territory before halting. The mutiny lasted approximately 36 hours. Its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former hot dog vendor turned catering billionaire turned warlord, then flew to Belarus under a deal brokered by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. 2 months later, Prigozhin's private jet fell out of the sky over Tver Oblast. All 10 people on board were killed. The mutiny shocked the world. What was less shocking to anyone who had been following the money was how it had been funded. Because for a decade before the June 2023 mutiny, the Wagner Group had been running one of the most sophisticated off-books financial operations in the modern world, extracting hundreds of millions of dollars from conflict zones across 3 continents, moving that money through shell companies, ghost payrolls, and commodity export networks, and doing so with the full knowledge and implicit authorization of a Russian state that publicly denied Wagner's existence while privately relying on it as a core instrument of foreign policy. This is the story of the Wagner wallet. And following it requires understanding how a private army finances itself when the country that created it refuses to admit it exists. The first thing to understand about Wagner's financial architecture is the legal paradox at its foundation. Russian law prohibited the formation of private military companies for most of Wagner's operational lifespan. There was no legal mechanism by which a private entity could hire soldiers, procure weapons, and deploy them to foreign conflicts. And yet Wagner did exactly this, openly for years, while Russian officials repeatedly denied its existence at press conferences and in international forums. This was not an oversight, it was the design. Wagner's extra-legal status was not a bug in the system. It was the feature that made the system work. Because a state that officially does not have soldiers in a country cannot be held diplomatically or legally accountable for what those soldiers do. Wagner provided the Kremlin with something no conventional military force could offer: complete plausible deniability, at scale, in multiple theaters simultaneously. The man who built this is worth examining closely. Yevgeny Prigozhin was not a soldier. He was a convicted criminal, jailed in the Soviet era for robbery and fraud, who rebuilt himself after the Soviet collapse as a restaurateur in St. Petersburg. His catering company Concord eventually won contracts to feed the Russian military and, more significantly, the Kremlin. This proximity to power gave him access. Access gave him contracts, and one of those contracts, sometime around 2014, was the implicit license to build and run what would become the Wagner Group, initially to provide deniable military force in eastern Ukraine and Crimea following Russia's annexation, and later deployed globally wherever Russian strategic interests required military presence without military fingerprints. Wagner's Africa operations are where the financial architecture became most visible. Beginning in 2018 in Sudan and expanding through the Central African Republic, Libya, Mali, Mozambique, Burkina Faso, and Niger, Wagner offered a product to fragile or authoritarian governments that Western powers could not or would not provide: security without conditions. No human rights requirements, no press freedom demands, no elections as a precondition for support. In exchange for deploying Wagner fighters to protect a government against rebel groups or coup attempts, Wagner extracted natural resource concessions, mining licenses, logging rights, and most importantly, access to gold. Sudan was the first and most instructive case. Beginning under the Omar al-Bashir government, Wagner established a relationship with Sudanese military and paramilitary leadership that survived Bashir's fall in 2019, the transitional government, and the 2021 coup that brought the Rapid Support Forces under General Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti, to power. Through a web of companies registered in Sudan, Russia, the UAE, and multiple African jurisdictions, Wagner-linked entities gained access to gold extraction operations in Sudan's Jebel Amer region. The gold was moved out of Sudan through the UAE, primarily through Dubai, which we have examined in this series as the world's most efficient money laundering hub, and processed into financial instruments that had no visible connection to Russia or to Wagner. The mechanics of the gold operation are worth understanding precisely because they illustrate how Wagner monetized its security services without ever creating a transaction that could be directly traced to the Russian state. A gold mining license would be issued by the host government to a locally registered company with nominally African directors. That company would be owned through a chain of shell entities by a holding structure registered in a jurisdiction with limited disclosure requirements. The gold extracted would be exported, often through informal channels that bypassed official assay offices, to refiners in the UAE or Turkey who asked few questions about origin. Those refiners would sell into legitimate commodity markets, and the revenues would flow back through the shell structure to ultimately benefit Prigozhin-linked entities registered in Russia, appearing on paper as legitimate business income from commodity trading. The Central African Republic operation followed a similar template but added a layer that made Wagner's financial model even more sustainable: direct payment in mining concessions rather than cash. Wagner fighters were deployed to protect KA President Faustin Archange Touadéra's government against multiple rebel coalitions. In exchange, the KA government granted mining licenses in gold and diamond producing areas to companies linked to Wagner's network. The fighters' salaries, some estimates suggest Wagner paid its African theater fighters between $1,000 and $5,000 per month, were funded in part by the commodity revenues extracted from the concessions. The operation was, in financial terms, largely self-funding. Wagner was being paid to be in Africa by the resources it was extracting from Africa. In Mali, where Wagner arrived in 2021 following a military coup that expelled French forces, the pattern replicated. Gold mining concessions in the Sikasso and Kayes regions, some of the richest gold-producing areas in West Africa, were granted to structures linked to Wagner's network. By 2022, according to researchers tracking commodity flows, Wagner-linked entities were extracting an estimated $2 billion in gold annually across its African theater of operations. This figure is disputed and difficult to verify precisely because of the opacity of the structures involved. But even conservative estimates place Wagner's Africa revenue in the hundreds of millions of dollars per year. This revenue served multiple functions simultaneously. It paid the fighters. It funded Wagner's operational expenses, weapons, logistics, communications equipment in a way that did not require direct transfers from the Russian state budget, and it generated profits that flowed back into structures under Prigozhin's control, making Wagner not just a state instrument but a genuine commercial enterprise with its own financial interests, its own client relationships, and its own strategic logic that was not always perfectly aligned with Moscow's. The ghost payroll structure that moved money to individual fighters deserves particular attention because it illustrates the level of financial engineering involved. Wagner fighters in Africa were not paid through any mechanism that would appear in a conventional financial intelligence sweep. Salaries were distributed partly in cash, physically couriered from operational headquarters to field units, and partly through cryptocurrency wallets, primarily in Bitcoin and USDT, that were maintained by handlers and emptied by fighters using local exchange networks in whichever country they were operating. Some fighters received payment in commodities, gold dust, raw gemstones, or simply goods extracted from the territories under Wagner control. The entire compensation architecture was designed to produce no traceable wire transfer, no correspondent bank record, no SWIFT transaction that could be subpoenaed by a Western financial intelligence agency and used to map the network. It was, in the assessment of researchers who have studied it, one of the most deliberately undetectable military payroll systems ever constructed. The divergence between Wagner's financial interests and the Kremlin's strategic interests is what ultimately produced the June 2023 mutiny. By the time Prigozhin launched his 36-hour rebellion, Wagner had become something that Russian military doctrine had never intended: a financially independent private army with its own command structure, its own revenue streams, its own global network of relationships, and its own leader who had developed enough confidence or miscalculated enough to publicly challenge the Russian military leadership on national television. The financial architecture that gave Wagner its operational effectiveness had also given it the autonomy that made it dangerous. After Prigozhin's death in August 2023, the Kremlin moved quickly to reabsorb Wagner's functions and, critically, its revenue streams. The Africa operations did not stop, they were reorganized. The entity that inherited Wagner's African contracts and fighting capacity was rebranded as the Africa Corps, operating under the direct oversight of Russian military intelligence, the GRU, rather than through Prigozhin's personal network. The mining concessions remained in place. The commodity export channels remained in place. The shell company structures that moved the money remained largely intact. What changed was the ownership layer at the top of the structure. The Kremlin had eliminated the independent operator and reasserted direct control over the wallet. What the Wagner wallet ultimately reveals is a template that extends well beyond Wagner or Russia. The use of deniable proxy forces funded by natural resource extraction in the countries where they operate is not a Russian invention. It has historical precedents across Cold War proxy conflicts in multiple continents involving multiple major powers. What Wagner refined was the financial sophistication of the model, the layered shell structures, the commodity export channels through permissive jurisdictions, the ghost payroll systems that made individual fighters functionally invisible to any financial intelligence agency examining transactions from the outside. The Wagner wallet was not simply a corruption scheme. It was a financial system, deliberately engineered to extract value from some of the world's poorest and most conflict-affected territories, to fund military operations that serve Russian state interests, and to do so in a way that leaves no direct financial fingerprint connecting those operations to the Russian government. It worked largely for nearly a decade, and the architecture that made it work, the shell companies, the commodity channels, the permissive jurisdictions, the compliant local partners, remains in place. The name on the door has changed, the wallet has not.